Welcome back to the Football Fitness Federation podcast. This is episode 209. I'm delighted to be joined on the podcast today by Matt Konopinski. Matt, how are we?
Very well, thank you. Thanks for having me on, Ben.
No problem at all, mate. Now, I've not mentioned your role. So, Director of Rehab and Performance at Rehab for Performance, top facility that I was very lucky to visit recently. Matt, that's obviously what you're doing currently, which we'll dive into in a second. But can you just sort of take us back a few steps, give us the career so far?
Yeah, sure. So my background is physiotherapy. So my early days were based in the NHS for about 4 years. And while I was doing that, I was working part-time in various academies at Leeds United and then later on at Barnsley. And then my first full-time role was with Barnsley and their under-18s many years ago. And I ended up as the lead first-team physio at Barnsley before getting the opportunity to join Liverpool. So I joined Liverpool in 2008, 2009. And I initially joined them looking after the reserves at the time. So it was before the under-23s had come into fruition. But spent most of my time there as the senior rehab physio working with the first team. And I was there for 10 years, ended up as head physio there. And I just felt like I needed a bit of a change at that point. So I then went to work with England for a period of time. Before joining Stephen, who I'd worked with previously at Rangers. And then COVID hit. My family hadn't gone to Scotland with me, so I wasn't prepared to live away from them. So I was like, made a decision to leave. And it was that point where I had a decision to make in terms of what I was going to do. And I'd always had this pipe dream of what Rehab for Performance has become, but never really had the drive, I suppose, or the need to do it, because I was always in, full-time employment, and it's a big move to do it. But yes, myself and my co-founder Chris Morgan, we sat down and I was like, look, if we're ever going to do it, I've got an opportunity to do it now. So whilst spending a period of time lecturing at Salford, which I also really enjoyed, over a period of about 12 months, Rehab for Performance came into the fold, and this is where we are now.
And how close, when you initially sort of had them ideas in your head, how close was it to what you do? Was it pretty much?
Yeah, so it wasn't too far away. Our real sort of like vision was to try and bring a football club out into more of a community setting. So we wanted to have really sort of like high-end expertise, multidisciplinary team, one-stop shop where people can come in and get directed and signposted to the right place, I think. And also be able to do it in what feels like an elite environment, so somewhere that most people don't ever get access to. And one of the things like we really felt was that people don't really often know where they should be going. So do I need to be working with a physio, or do I need soft tissue, or do I need to see a strength and conditioning coach? Do I need to see a sports medicine consultant? Who should I really be with at this point in time? Or do I need to go and see a specialist? And I think, no disrespect, because they do an amazing job and they have to have so many hats on, but I think GPs don't really know where people need to go a lot of the time as well when they've got a neuromusculoskeletal injury. So that's where we sit. So we have general population coming in here. We also have elite athletes coming in here, and everything in between. And for me, it's allowed me to work with different sports as well, because I was 18 years or so just working in professional football. So it's been really, really interesting for me from that perspective.
Yeah, I've got to say, anyone that hasn't seen the sort of setup and what the guys have got going there, it's a super, super impressive facility and some great work being done there as well. Matt, in terms of the team now, you've sort of mentioned about maybe some of the reasons people might go to your facility, but in terms of the team and team members, who have you got over there now?
So we've got Alan Jordan is our strength and conditioning coach. I think Alan's been on your podcast before.
He has.
So he's got a background in Game Changer and working as strength and conditioning coach for Liverpool FC women's and Everton women's teams. We have a sports and exercise medicine consultant, Nigel Jones, who is chief medical officer for British Cycling, who also has a stellar background in rugby as head of. I think his title was first team doctor for England rugby, and he's also worked with multiple national clubs as well. Also worked at Liverpool. Jo Gibson is our shoulder physio. For those who haven't heard of Jo, she's an internationally recognised upper limb specialist. And then we've also got soft tissue therapists. So we got Phil McDonald and Paul Tremarco work here, backgrounds in British cycling and soft tissue for the Premier League refs, respectively. And we have some subcontractors as well who work part-time for us as well. So Paul Squires, Scott McCauley, also from a footballing background.
Brilliant. So people are in safe hands.
Certainly are.
Awesome. How's it been for you, Matt, in terms of going from employee to business owner?
That has been a steep learning curve. Because you know, for on the one hand, it's been challenging because I'm delivering 24/7 as well as having to, manage the business. And that is a sort of like very different role to just managing your team as well. So, a lot of us within sport will be looking after a group of professionals and managing them, but you're not actually having to manage, the accounts.
Yeah.
Make sure sort of like the gas is being paid and, all sorts of things. And at the moment, the facility is growing, but it's not grown to the extent where if something breaks, you just get sort of like the maintenance to come in and sort it out. It's like, right, that's broken, so I've got to fix that. The cleaners haven't come in today, so we're gonna have to clean, right?
Yeah.
So it is very challenging, but it's been brilliant to sort of like have that insight into owning and running your own business, and it's certainly improved me from business management perspective and management of people and individuals. So it's been challenging, but a really good challenge.
I think anyone that has any sort of business will say that a lot of the lessons come from experience, don't they? And something you have to learn pretty quickly.
Yeah, I think so. And it's expectations as well. And, what's realistic expectations as a business owner. And it's certainly, in the environment we work in as well, it's making sure that everything's right in terms of like the legislature and lots of other bits and pieces as well. So for us to have a doctor working here, you have to be CQC registered, which means essentially you're like a mini hospital. But to qualify for that, you have to have all the policies of a hospital as well. So it's just insane in terms of the amount of paperwork and background stuff you've got to do to get that over the line. But
yeah, I bet.
All good. And then, we're all the better for having someone like Nigel here, so that raises the profile of the organisation, but also, enables us to just refer sideways rather than having to refer out of the business. And you can have those conversations, and those, those discussions and case discussions within your team rather than it having to sort of like be outsourced somewhere else.
Yeah, I imagine for the team as a whole, that's so beneficial, but also for whether it's a player or a client coming in, that one-stop shop is just ideal, isn't it? That's what they want. They want to go into one place and get whatever it is sorted. And
Yeah, exactly. And you know, they want to feel like what they're going into replicates the environment they're used to. A lot of athletes are coming in here, and the environment is superseding what they're used to. So it's really good from that perspective. So yeah, it's the support staff are integral, obviously, to everything that goes on.
and how do you find having the professional athletes alongside your sort of general population?
Do you know, it's actually it's actually really good, and again, it just epitomizes our vision for what the place was. I mean, you know, you've been in here. The facility is predominantly a gym. We have some consulting rooms at the back, and you know, and they get used, but we're not a gym, so we don't have, like, you know, I don't know, a small gym might have sort of like 40 or 50 people in at any one time. We don't have that. So you might have 2 or 3 elite athletes in here and a member of the general population. It's very private, and you know, I think the same for the general population. They can come in here and feel like it's private, and you know, they're not going to get they're not going to get any sort of bother from anyone. It's the same for the professionals. So it actually everyone's very respectful of each other as well, I think. So
Yeah.
it's actually nice, and there's interaction between, you know, the elite athletes and the general population, and it's just like it's really organic and really nice to see.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I was really keen to ask that from all your experience and time at clubs to now working in this private facility away from a club. What has been the difference for you from the play, maybe from the players' perspective? Like, would you see a change in the players' maybe attitude, or is there anything different in terms of working with players in that environment?
I think you take yourself out of the political situation that is present in the club. So, you know, there's always obviously some element of politics going on in any organisation, but when the player comes away from that and sits here, everything associated with that, the multiple stakeholders that can influence what's happening, it's almost like it's a bit of a what's the word I'm looking for? I suppose you're just removed from it, so it makes it easier for the athlete or the player, and it makes it easier for us as well. What we do make sure that we do is have really transparent and open dialogue with the clubs all the time, so that they have like full overview in terms of what the individual's doing all the time. And that's really important to us, that we kind of bolt on with the medical department, with the sports science department of the organisation that the individuals come from, rather than being seen as something very separate. So I think it's less challenging in terms of the players come away from any politics that might be present at the club. And look, that might be nothing. You know, that might be nothing. It might just be the player just wanting a change of scenery. You know, yeah. And more often than not, that's a lot of what it is. But also us being respectful of the fact that, you know, we're here to support the club, not to upset the apple cart at all, but actually just support the club and support the individual. I think from a personal perspective, coming out of a football club environment and working with the general population, a lot of the professional athletes will be here for half a day or a day, and almost like residential here. But aside from that, you have an individual coming in for an hour, and used to spending half a day or a day with one person, to then have to sort of box that all into 1 hour, that is a big challenge. So for me, initially, my expectations of what I should be delivering, and also then what should be coming back to me, were well in excess of what was realistic.
Yeah.
Because I'm seeing that person for 1 hour, and then, you know, the rest of the week that they're not with you. So I've definitely had to sort of like reframe what's realistic as well.
Yeah, I actually spoke to David O'Sullivan about this because we were talking about sort of club to private sort of comparison in terms of rehab. And he was talking about like all the conversations or even just like passing by of a player that you do day to day, little interactions even throughout the day where you could have with players that's suddenly taken away, isn't it? When you're seeing them just for that short amount of time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
It's funny when you think of it like that, isn't it? Because you think, oh, private, I've got a lot more time with the player. I'm one-on-one, but you're taking away all that additional time.
Yeah, for the majority of like, that obviously we'll get some, we're talking sort of very specifically about football players here. We'll get some players who will come in and I'll see them for an hour or something. And yeah, for sure that's different. But the majority, are probably here for longer. So if you've got half a day, do you know what I mean? It's like perfect, and it's very concentrated, and there isn't anything else going on. It's just you're just one-to-one there. So that's very different. But it's more sort of like the general population coming in that has been the challenge for me, in the sense where I'm thinking, well, I should be doing this, and it's like I haven't got the time to do that. So you then have to prioritize and really go for the low hanging fruit.
Yeah.
So I'd say they're the things that I noticed the most about it. And also, like going back to what we said before, it's not just purely focusing on delivery and the rehab. It's like actually there's a whole load of other business stuff that needs to get done.
Yeah, 100%. So with players coming out to you, I wanted to focus on, obviously we can dive into all sorts of different injuries and different elements for the podcast, but I thought it'd be good to focus. We've not touched on ACLs for a little bit of time, so I thought it'd be a good opportunity for that. So just initially, when you're going through this rehab process of an ACL with a player, again, just the last bit in terms of this comparison from club to private, but is there any main differences throughout a rehab process with a player of an ACL injury from private to club?
I suppose aside from the fact that you may or may not have the same period of time with the individual, so speaking very specifically about football, I suppose, and professional footballers, does it differ a huge amount? I suppose we might get somebody coming in at various stages of their rehab. So you could get somebody who's come in and actually they've hit a bit of a wall. They're struggling with something. There's some complexity around what they're feeling, or that they've got pain in a certain area and they can't push on. It could be that, or it might be actually somebody who's like at the very start of their rehab. So you're hitting the ground running. And I suppose the other things are, when you're in a club, you're always there at the very beginning. You're there when the injuries happened, and all the way through. Whereas you miss that stuff. So, as an example, you might miss those interactions in terms of what the player's been told about their injury, and what their attitude is in terms of their recovery, and their prognosis. I suppose one of the most obvious things there is, players are always looking to get back as quickly as they can, so it's always this race in terms of like, how quickly can I get back? I want to do it in 6 months because I've seen so and so do it in 6 months. And again, that can be challenging because what we know from research is that essentially 100% of people think that they're going to get back to the same level that they're at, irrespective of how quick it is. But again, the data doesn't back that up. The data suggests that it's anywhere between 60 and 80% of people that get back to the same level. And then also we know that rehab will typically take 9 to 12 months. But also that will vary depending on the complexity of the injury. So we always tend to talk about ACL injuries, but here we we've retermed it and just bracketed it all under complex knee injuries because there's so many subdivisions of what that injury could be. You know, and because you miss that, you miss those conversations around, right, what graft have you had? So, you know, is it realistic for your quads to come back in this period of time, given that you've had a bone patellar tendon bone graft? Probably not, you know, potentially, because we know it's going to take longer versus whether you'd had a hamstring graft. And then, you know, it's vice versa if you have a hamstring graft and your hamstring strength coming back in a certain period of time. And that's foregoing whether there's any concomitant damage in terms of meniscus. If you had a meniscal repair, you know, you might have had a hamstrings avulsion, you know, anything could have happened that is going to affect that clinical journey and your prognosis and when you're going to sort of like get through certain hurdles. And you've often missed those conversations. So, you know, if you've got someone who's coming in and it's already been framed that, yep, you're going to be back in 7 months, it's like, okay, right. And what do we then do in terms of those conversations and what's realistic? And, you know, the surgeon said I can run. It's like, okay, you can run, but, you know, actually, have you got the capability to, you know, absorb force with your knee? You know, have you achieved all the criteria that we want you to achieve? Which will mean that actually, you know, we expect that you can return to running without a stiff knee, you know, because we're happy with the minimum amount of quad function that you need. Someone incoming that hasn't had those conversations and it's been more a surgical opinion in terms of, right, okay, at 8 weeks you can start running, for example. That's when you've got to reframe stuff and engage with the player and make them understand your rationale behind where you want them to go, because we know that if they don't have that, then they're going to be running with a stiff knee. You know, they're not going to be comfortable. They'll likely refuse, these sorts of things.
There's a couple of things off the back of that. I'm guessing ideally for you, in terms of that rehab process, would be for a player to come in as soon as possible to see you. But then also with that, someone coming into an environment like yours, you're removing a lot of external noise, aren't you, as well?
Yeah.
That you might get at clubs.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think the caveat is as well, is I suppose what I've done there, I've given a couple of examples of how it could be challenging, but also, you know, there's more often than not, it's not challenging because, you know, you've got like-minded professionals who've sort of like set the rehab pathway out properly, you know. Yeah. So it's not an issue. But yeah, you're right. You're removing that noise. And you know, sometimes that's why someone might be coming to you, you know, for that sort of reason. But again, I think it's just about, from our perspective, it's making sure that you're there to assist them, but also assist the club, and not become somebody who's actually, you know, siding with one or the other. That doesn't work. And unfortunately, I'd say, having spent a lot of time in football, you know, I've been in that position where there are externals that actually just confound problems, and compound is what I meant, not confound. Compound problems, because they could be suggesting something that's in complete contrast with where you feel they should be from a club perspective, and that just muddies the waters, makes it very difficult, can make relationships with the player very difficult. We try and do the exact opposite here.
Yeah. Just because you've understood both sides of that, Matt, what would be your best bit of advice for both sides as well on making that interaction as smooth as possible? Because I know there'll be people listening that is probably either in a private facility or working privately with players, but there'll also be a hell of a lot of people at clubs that maybe their players are going out to different places. So from you experiencing both sides, what would be your top bit of advice on that and making those interactions smooth?
That's a good question.
Possible.
I think from a club perspective, I think more so than ever, I think there's got to be an appreciation that players will seek external support at times, and not to feel like that is in any way an indictment on your abilities. I think a lot of players just like to have an external voice or go somewhere where, like you said, it's a different environment, and they're getting away from some of that noise a little bit. So and look, I've been in that position where I've definitely been like, well, why would they go there? Why would they go somewhere else? They've got us here.
Yeah.
And I've definitely felt that. But certainly now, at the top level, players are seeing people externally. So I think within a club, you can either embrace that and try and facilitate it and have good relationships, and maybe signpost athletes in certain directions to try and make the process as good as you can. Or, the other option is to stonewall it, and then, again, you're just going to struggle in terms of your relationships with the players, and that's going to make life very difficult. From a private practitioner's perspective, without wanting to sound like I'm repeating myself again, it really would be that one whereby think of yourself as a bolt-on service to the club. You're in addendum to their department. You're not a completely outsourced, separate entity, and you're there to help them and support them as well as support the player, and not be the sort of like the man in between or woman.
Yeah, 100%. That's great advice. I know you've probably touched on a few of these already, but if we go back to the sort of ACL rehab, what would be some of the key elements of that rehab process?
That's a tough question, because it depends on where you're at, and what stage you're going through. I think as an overall theme, like, quad is key. It's your means to control that external knee flexor moment, and without your ability to do that, you're potentially compromising knee function and future injury. I also am a strong advocate here, and this is a big bias of mine, but I'm a strong advocate of motion capture, and I think that's because my interest in it is fueled by the fact that we aren't killing it in terms of ACL rehab. I spoke about sort of like before in terms of quoting some numbers around returning to professional sport and actually returning at the same level. It's not happening, and why is that? And there's more evidence coming out at the moment, particularly from SSC and Enda King's work, where they've found that, for example, if you're looking at a drop jump, so they looked at athletes that had a contralateral ACL injury after their initial, and they're seeing things like increased hip flexion, increased knee flexion, resulting in like longer ground contact times. So there's a reduction in RSI, but jump height's not changing. So the performance looks the same in terms of jump height, but because they're spending longer on the ground and they're exhibiting these kinematic features such as increased knee flexion, there's a clear difference there. And I suppose ACL injuries happen within the first sort of like, the ACL's gone within the first 40 milliseconds of your injury mechanism. So reactive strength around the knee is probably important, isn't it? And you might not be seeing that unless you're looking at your kinetics and your kinematics. Similarly, with unplanned change of direction, they found some similar things there in terms of trunk sway, and that was increased in ACL injured athletes that suffered a re-injury actually on the ipsilateral side. But strength testing hadn't really varied between those that did suffer or didn't suffer a re-injury. So I think your motion capture can really provide more insight. It sounds cheesy, but I've said before, it provides insight that's lost to eyesight. So you're looking at the performance that seems the same, but actually, the way that it's being done is not, and we're seeing sort of like differences in athletes that are going on to sort of like suffer issues,
Yeah.
So there are a couple of things sort of like that I'd definitely focus on within my rehab, and again, caveat to that being we're fortunate here to be able to implement that, and again, that's one of my biases and one of the things I really wanted to bring in here.
I know a lot of these questions are tough because we've not got a specific sort of case study and timings and actual person that you're dealing with, but some of that was great. So that sort of information is absolutely perfect. Just tapping into some of the experiences. But in terms of like plyos, jumping, landing, generally, what are the thoughts on that in that process, and where do they tend to appear?
I think again, it depends largely on like the clinical picture. Have you got a nice quiet knee, and have you got good quads function? So if you have, then you can progress through your jump land stream, which might be, have you got a symmetrical squat? And again, I'd be looking at kinetic data as well as kinematic data. Have you got a symmetrical single leg squat? So both of those are going to require a good level of quadricep strength and soleus strength. And then it's a gradual streaming from there in terms of the complexity of what's integrated, and the knee effusion and the form is going to be a barometer of whether the knee is coping or not.
Yeah, real. And then just working through progressions from that point.
Absolutely, yeah. So it's just common sense progressions. There are certain criteria that we would use in terms of, initiating running, and our preparedness to really progress into that single limb loading and pitch and what have you. But I think, again, a lot of it just comes down to basic principles. If you can control that external knee flexion moment, then you're going to be able to land. You're not going to land with a stiff knee. Now, obviously, the requirements for decelerating and an acute change of direction are different to the requirements to just returning to running. So that they will differ vastly, and you have to make sure that you can break that down and fill in the gaps to transition to that level. Like I said, whilst always keeping an eye on the knee and seeing whether it's coping or not.
And if we're looking at from a prehab perspective now, whether we like that term or not, it makes sense. If we're looking from that perspective now on fit players and areas to sort of work on to hopefully avoid ACLs going forward, where would your focus lie with that?
Okay, so this is looking at sort of like trying to mitigate ACL injury. Yeah. So, well, we've already touched on one, I suppose. So having really strong quads is going to help you, because that's going to allow you to cope with braking, to cope with positions the knee might get into, and mitigate internal knee varus, so an external knee valgus force, and cope with that. So I think that's important. I think I'm a big fan of strengthening soleus and glute med. We know from a change of direction perspective that they're the big players in terms of mitigating deleterious ACL loads, so that knee valgus load, they're really important. Although they don't cross the knee joint, they're key players. So from a strength perspective, I think you need to be nailing that from a lower limb perspective. Trunk is really important. And, I'd really sort of like us to get to a point where clubs are running a team through change of direction and getting the kinematic and kinetic data before the season starts, and having not only having the benchmark and the baseline data of how players are performing those tasks, but also use it to inform programming. So, for example, if somebody has got a lot of lateral trunk flexion, okay, right, so, how are you going to target that, and what exercises are going to assist to try and mitigate that whilst their final foot contact is playing out? Because we know that is going to increase knee valgus moment. Knee valgus moment alone is not going to result in an ACL injury, but it's going to contribute to it, and that's important. How is someone operating in terms of their penultimate step? Are they effective, or their anti-penultimate step? Are they absorbing forces before then trying to change direction? And if they're not, well, how does that then marry with their isokinetic data? Are we seeing a discrepancy in terms of quads function there? Are they not strong enough, or is it they're just not able to control that eccentric RFD? And that's where you need to focus your exercises. So, ideal world, I'd like to see people running through a change of direction, getting the mocap data, and then just comparing that with their strength data and their jump data. To get a real sort of like broad picture and where they're going to go to individualize the work that they want their players to do, because for sure, there'll be vast differences across players.
Yeah, and I know that's tough because we're talking broadly about essentially dealing with individuals, which is really tough to do, isn't it? But
I think that's it. It's like, what's your rationale for your profiling? And that's also going to be dictated by how much time have you got, and what have you. We're really fortunate here to have markerless motion capture technology, so we can run people through a change of direction very quickly and get through a squad very quickly. But unless you've got that, if you're having to marker everybody up, that's going to take a long time. However, you could choose to just do it with 2D motion capture, with a 2D camera, because we know that there's actually quite good correlation between what you're seeing kinematically and visually and the kinetic data and the forces that are occurring around the knee, from the group at Salford led by Tom Dos Santos and Paul Jones. So, there's other options around there, that's for sure.
Brilliant. Matt, I don't want to keep you all day, so I want to move on to some quick fire questions, if you don't mind, so you can get home and get some tea. So first one I always ask is, who've been some of the biggest influences on your career so far?
Okay, so I suppose your parents is always sort of like the easy one, isn't it? But in terms of individuals, I'd say my co-founder for R4P that I've worked with for a long time, Chris Morgan, just in terms of that professional relationship, but also our relationship as mates has been integral over the years. And then I think some key players that I've worked with, certainly having been fortunate to be around the likes of Steven Gerrard and what have you. Certainly, I can use him as my benchmark for my expectations of all players and all athletes. So, that's that's my benchmark and level for how I expect them to commit to rehab, and how I expect them to treat myself and others as a person. Yeah.
Brilliant. What would you say your biggest strength is as a practitioner?
I'd say my biggest strength is probably my biggest weakness as well, which is details. I'm a details guy. That's brilliant, and I think that's why I've been really successful. But it's also you also have to be realistic, and when you've got the details, it's how you interpret them, because you can get yourself wrapped up in knots if you don't actually use that detail, and then consider it against what's actually relevant.
Yeah, 100%. And if we were to go back a few years, pre R4P, pre Liverpool, what would be your top bit of career advice for yourself?
Don't stress the small stuff. Yeah, don't worry about what you can't control. Again, it's a bit cheesy, isn't it? But control the controllables, because there's so many things that can contribute to stress levels in an elite environment. And a lot of the time, I think, the complexities around that, and we can really get ourselves stressed out when it's like, you know what, just work on what you can change.
Yeah. And then finally, I always ask about CPD, continued development, and obviously working with a team like you do there, I'm sure there's opportunity to learn all the time. But do you take any sort of specific approach to that? Is it reading research articles? Like, how do you go about that?
I think, find your area of interest, and that will vary, and then just sort of like have a dive into it. But don't feel like courses are the only way that you're going to achieve that information. Like you said, it might be an article you read, but also I think you can't benefit more highly than just spending time with people. Again, I've been very fortunate in terms of people I've worked with, but also when I've worked with externals myself, and spent time with them. Just try and pull off as much information as you can from other people and just absorb that. So I think, if you've got an interest, look at someone who's really good in that area, or an organization that's really good in that area, and see if you can spend some time there. I think that would be my bit of advice.
Brilliant. Matt, that was quality, mate. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
No, pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Just finally, if anyone's got questions for you, but then also about R4P as well, like, where would you direct people?
Yeah, so our Twitter and Instagram feeds are R4P_UK. The website is www.rehabforperformance.com. And equally, if anyone wants to direct anything my way, my Twitter is Matt_Cono. I think I'd have to double check it.
I'll put it in the show notes.
Yeah, perfect.
Brilliant, mate. Matt, thank you very much for your time, and keep up the great work over there. Top man.
Sorry?
Thank you, mate. I said keep up the great work. Keep up the great work.
Will do. Yeah, will do. And you. Take it easy,
mate. Bye.
Bye-bye.